Mr. Pugliaresi, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Pallone, Chairman McNerney, Ranking Member Upton, Ranking Member Rogers, members of the subcommittee, I want to thank you for the opportunity to testify on these proposed legislative initiatives. We are now in the midst of an energy crisis that may last for years to come. A mix of forces have led to this crisis, including accelerated demand as the world economies rebound from the pandemic lockdowns, sustained underinvestment in fossil fuels, and a fundamental misunderstanding of the impact of government policies on energy markets. Clearly, the Ukraine war has exacerbated this crisis, but these disruptions to our energy systems were well underway before the war began. If I could have the first slide, please. Thank you. As you can see here, rising prices are especially harmful to low-income households. 40% of these households are seeing very rapid increases between 2020 and 2021. 2022 is a nightmare, okay? Next slide, please. Look, we have put an enormous amount of effort at EPRINC in understanding the scale challenges of moving to net zero. But this graphic shows you that in the absence of large supplies of natural gas, we would only have enough fertilizer to feed about 3 billion of the planet's 8 billion people. Large supplies of low-cost natural gas are critical to food security. I'd like to also point out that 4 pillars of modern civilization, cement, plastics, ammonia, and steel, have no cost-effective substitute. Next slide. As you can see here, the rising fertilizer prices are also spiking food costs, and they are also increasing the increase in natural gas with ammonia prices and corn. So we have a kind of perfect storm of rising prices from higher fossil fuel prices. Next slide. Okay. We need a massive amount of critical minerals in order to engage in a rapid transition to the fuels and energy sources of the future. As noted in my written testimony, most of these minerals and materials for the energy system have been sourced outside of the OECD. In this regard, H.R. 1599 appropriately recognizes that the energy transition offers the potential to somewhat insulate us from volatility and supply chain disruptions associated with oil and gas production, but it will introduce a new set of supply risks. It's appropriate that these critical minerals and materials be fully incorporated into the Department of Energy's ongoing responsibilities to bolster supply, to bolster U.S. energy security. Next slide. Yes, any of us who thought that by moving to these fuels of the future, these energy sources of the future, that we would eliminate risks for volatility can just look at what's happening now. In fact, we issued a chart of the week today that looked at nearly a doubling in the cost of the Tesla battery, and you can see that price indices for key electric vehicle battery metals have been just skyrocketing in cost. It's not going to relieve our problems with volatility and supply risks. Next slide. One way to get down gasoline prices is to build out the infrastructure and the capacity of the North American oil and gas production platform. As you can see here, between 2010 and 2020, the United States alone, provided over 80% of world incremental demand for petroleum. And it was in that period that we had extremely low gasoline prices. The North American Petroleum Platform is an instrument, sort of, if you like, a strategic asset for the United States. It's essentially the arsenal of energy security. Next slide. The U.S. is also a major supplier of natural gas, not just to our industry, but to the world market. Right now, if you see the sort of negative sign there is actually a plus for exports. We are exporting 10 billion cubic feet a day. This is roughly equivalent to 40% of European requirements for their import needs for natural gas. And I will find one last slide. Next slide. I know that we are looking for ways to reduce gasoline prices, and probably you're tired of hearing from us on this, but one way that we could take 30 cents off the price of gasoline, much more than a gasoline tax, would be to make a small adjustment in the renewable fuel standard to take it down to close to the market-based level, which would be about 10%. This will take back some of the high compliance costs and other factors in the market that are driving up gasoline prices. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I conclude my remarks.
Mr. Pugliaresi, I want to give you the opportunity to address the energy crisis that we're facing today. We use fossil fuels for everything in our economy, from plastics and fertilizer. Your graphs were terrific. What are some of the near-term solutions to record-setting energy prices that we ought to be looking at and focused on? We know about Keystone, and we know about permitting infrastructure needs with NEPA reforms, sending the right signal. But what are some basic things that we ought to be focused on, and what might you suggest that we do?
Yeah, so first, we need to send the right signals to the marketplace. We need to restore the leasing program. We need to give confidence that the North American production platform can have an expansive, cost-efficient expansion over time. And the government is heavily involved in affecting that outcome. We need to permit a lot more natural gas pipelines. The Marcellus, West Virginia, Pennsylvania, Ohio, these are enormous gas reserves. They have production levels that look like Saudi Arabia if they were oil. We can double or triple U.S. natural gas production in the United States. We can keep our prices low, and we can supply the world. We are, as I said, an arsenal of energy security, but we have to change the policies. We need to give insurance in these constant intervention. I mean, I know you're quite familiar with Line 5. These constant regulatory and political attacks on Line 5, they create risk in the marketplace. People start to wonder, okay, what's next?
Well, can you imagine, for the folks that don't know about Line 5, this is a line that connects the Upper Peninsula with the Lower Peninsula of Michigan, and that line needs to be replaced. There's no question about that. It was built in the late 50s, I think it was, 60-some years ago. But I can't imagine the impact on gas prices in the Midwest if that line was simply cut off and not replaced in terms of the impact at that Marathon refinery in southeast Michigan.
Independent estimates show shutting that line would increase consumer costs by $58 billion.
Yeah.
We can do more for the fuel supply. We should try to get a more national standard for fuel specs.
Let me ask you one more question in my remaining 15 seconds or so. Microchips. We've got legislation that passed the Senate big time more than a year ago. Does this have an impact on energy? If we're able to get something like this back through so we can actually build it ourselves versus rely on China?
Absolutely. A reliable supply of microchips adds a lot to the efficiency of our entire production process. All the inputs into petroleum production, all the inputs into industrial production. So it's a very important supply chain issue.
Yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chairman, first and foremost, I'm a mom. We recently remodeled my kitchen, our kitchen, and I didn't like my choices of dishwashers. And today, because of what was available, we wash most of our dishes by hand. But I'm going to get back to some of my questions that I think are really important for energy reliability and affordability. Mr. Pugliaresi, I wanted to thank you for returning to the committee. Appreciate your testimony. Last year, you testified in front of our committee, and you warned. You said that it was important for us to look to the example of Germany and their approach in imposing various top-down policy dictates, shutting down certain energy sources, and the result of being more dependent upon Russia. You noted that spiking energy costs there and elsewhere were a warning for us as U.S. policymakers, and that was months before Russia invaded Ukraine. Americans now see the risk and we see the impact on reliability and affordability. In the United States, there's been an unrelenting drive to shut down fossil energy with weather-dependent wind and solar. Do you think the policy debate over this rush to green movement would benefit from authoritative information on what is necessary to secure energy resources, including critical minerals?
Absolutely. We need a much better understanding of the risks. By the way, Germany has now fired up its major coal plants, and from the folks we talked to there, their climate program is delayed by at least a decade.
So in the late 1970s, the Department of Energy was organized as a cabinet agency to oversee national energy policy and specifically address energy supply emergencies. H.R. 1599 provides a new function in the department's core statute to evaluate energy resource vulnerabilities, both for critical materials of renewables and for traditional energy. How do you think that this might be useful in putting energy security back at the center of our debate?
Right. If we move to a set of systems where we are reliant on these critical materials and minerals, we're particularly reliant on foreign sources that are not necessarily friendly, actually might be quite hostile to the United States. We need a careful assessment of what that means to our energy security and the reliability of our energy complex.
Thank you. So we hear from our colleagues on the other side of the aisle in the administration that a move to renewable energy will reduce energy price volatility, which we're all experiencing at the gas pump these days. Is the answer to record high gas prices to increase dependence on critical minerals and materials for renewable energy?
It's very difficult to hide from the volatility of any commodity. The way we, on our traditional energy complex, is we had a large strategic petroleum reserve. We had an expansive program to expand U.S. oil and gas production, diversified production, not just around the North America, but around the world. These are the features that add to your energy security.
Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Lieberman, appreciate your testimony. One of the questions I have about the legislation amending the weatherization program concerns taxpayers.
Chair, I'm pleased we're coming together today to discuss concrete actions we can take to help bolster our energy infrastructure and deliver reliable, affordable, and clean energy to our constituents. However, I must emphasize my disappointment in the majority's unwillingness to discuss some of the most pressing issues facing my constituents and our constituents on the energy front. Last week, gasoline prices climbed to over $5 a gallon nationwide. In my home state of Indiana, Hoosiers are paying on average $5.11 per gallon for regular gasoline and over $6 per gallon for diesel. My constituents are also facing the potential risk of rolling blackouts this summer due to insufficient grid resource capacity. And this isn't my opinion. This is according to MISO, the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator, and also some utilities in the region. Our constituents are hurting from the Biden administration's ideologically motivated energy agenda that puts the goals of the radical environmental groups above the needs of the American families. As has been said many times in this committee by my colleagues and I, this is a dangerous approach that will significantly hamper our ability to reliably and affordably meet our energy needs moving forward. Some countries around the world are already experiencing dramatic reckonings resulting from such an approach that's being proposed by the administration and are being forced to take drastic action literally as we speak. For example, Germany, the Netherlands, Italy, and Austria recently announced intentions to bring back some coal-fired power plant generation due to their inability to meet energy needs with intermittent renewables without Russian gas. Who would have thought that the Russian gas would go away? You have to have capacity yourself. This may put them back at the starting gate when it comes to decreasing their carbon emissions and their climate goals over time. In fact, some politicians in Germany are now discussing openly, publicly, the possibility of overturning the country's 2017 ban on hydraulic fracturing or fracking to increase the domestic supply of gas. Wow, what an idea. We should think about that in some of our states here in America. Why would America, with our own vast resources, follow down the pathway we're witnessing in Europe? We're not trying to reinvent the wheel here. So, Mr. Pugliaresi, when I questioned you before a joint hearing of the Environmental and Energy Subcommittees last fall, you said that we could affect prices if we ensure that our domestic oil and gas industry remains efficient and produce at capacity. So prices are continuing to rise. What are we missing out on here?
I think part of the problem, of course, was that the lockdowns, in my view, were excessive, and they resulted in a lot of our supply chains being disrupted. So we had a real problem coming out of the lockdown. But we also have a real problem on expectations, as Ben had spoke about previously. I'd like to point out one thing. Recently, President Biden visited Japan, and the two
And I was
leaders-
just there too myself.
Yes, Prime Minister Kishida and the President issued a lot of joint statements. But when it come time to make a joint statement on the importance of LNG exports and the importance of more investment in U.S. oil and gas, only Prime Minister Kishida was on that statement. President Biden refused to join him in calling for more investment in U.S. oil and gas. We need to kind of change the dialogue. These investments in oil and gas production infrastructure, they are long-term, they require regulatory certainty, and they require investment certainty, and we don't have that right now.
Yeah, I mean, on my recent trip to Japan with some other members, bipartisan, the Prime Minister told us, and his people told us the same thing. You know, when we were talking energy policy, they want to be partners. And they're completely dependent on imported energy, as you probably know. And they want to be partners with us on LNG and other sources of energy. They're desperate to work with us on these issues. Absolutely. So the rolling blackouts looming in Indiana and elsewhere across the country are there. I mean, it's also for you. How can we increase grid resource capacity to minimize the possibilities of power outages? How do we minimize that? I mean,
we have not invested enough in the grid, and we have not invested enough in systems that can back up and provide reliability for intermittent power. And there are a lot of ways to address this. Some time ago, I spoke to Chairman Chatterjee when he was chairman of FERC, and I said, why don't we have everybody bid firm power? Let the solar folks, the wind folks, come to the table with 24-hour power, and at least we would have some price discovery. We don't really know what the cost of intermittent power is, because it's not the same as baseload power. It's a different product.
understood. I yield back.